Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, sponsored by the National Health Association. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I'm absolutely delighted today to have as my guest Dr. Marc Bekoff. Marc is the Professor Emeritus of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Colorado in Boulder. He is an ambassador for the Jane Goodall Roots and Shoots program, co-chair with Jane Goodall of the Ethics Committee for her Jane Goodall Institute, and a co-founder with Jane Goodall of the organization Ethologists for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. He's written somewhere between 30 and 40 books, including encyclopedias on all things related to really animal life, animal mind, the processing, the communication of animals, human-animal communication, books like Minding Animals, the summary of his research, The Emotional Lives of Animals, children's books like Jasper's Way, the Saving Moon Bears, and the more current book, Dogs Demystified, an A to C guide to all things canine. And Marc, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to meet you and to speak with you. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here and get into some broader topics than what
and I want to just tell our audience, I mean, when I went into your website and really looked and was learning a little bit more about you, it was daunting. I was really in awe of this, the number of things you've written and the things that you've accomplished and the accolades. So I just want to tell our audience that I would have to do an introduction about as long as this interview to cover the things that you've done. And I urge people to go online to really check out and really see the breadth of things that you have really been doing with your professional and personal life. So it's really pretty amazing. I want to start off with something, because when I was reading an article that you had written highlighting your early years as kind of a competitive athlete and talking about your first foray into being mindful of animals as a small child in your Brooklyn neighborhood, thinking about the cats, the birds, the squirrels, the dogs. What were they feeling? What were they doing? How did that early beginning segue through the earlier parts of your life and then lead into the kind of PhD work and research that you began to really do later? Can you talk a little bit about that for our audience?
Oh, yeah. I was born in Brooklyn, and I used to go out right after I could walk, and I'd see all the dogs and cats in the neighborhood and the squirrels and the ants and the birds. And I would always ask my parents, what were they thinking and feeling, basically. And the phrase minding animals actually came from a talk I had with my folks. And it really means that I minded them. I took care of them. I cared about them. And I minded them by attributing, active minds and brains to them. It's always been there. My path to today, if you will, or maybe not literally today, but to what I've been doing for decades was pretty nonlinear. But my mom was a really empathic woman, and my father was the biggest optimist I've ever met in my life, even through very difficult times. And I think it's in my DNA, if you will. But always, somewhat subliminal sometimes, but always there was, I really wanted to study animals, non-human animals. And I really wanted to learn more about mostly how they feel, sentience, but what they know, so sort of the cognitive side of the coin.
So what was your actual early research for your own PhD? What was the subject of that?
It was on the development of behavior in wolves, dogs, coyotes, coyote dog hybrids, and wolf dog hybrids. Because Yeah, that was basically it. Social behavior. Yeah.
Well, I noticed that a lot of the focus of what you had focused on through the years was, of course, animal behavior, and then something called cognitive ethology, and then, of course, evolutionary behavior ecology, and what you call compassionate conservation. For our audience, describe what that concept, cognitive ethology, really means, so they're on that page to understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, it really refers to the study of animal minds, how they work and what's in them. And I've always been against really invasive research, and I'm glad to see, modern day techniques, neuroimaging techniques like fMRI are being used to learn more about what non-human brains are doing, say in different contexts, or when the animals have to solve a certain problem. So it's really, it really is just simply the study of non-human minds, what they're thinking and what they're feeling.
Well, the work that you've done and the work of others too has laid the groundwork to understand the individuality of animals of all species. And what comes up out of that is not only that they're individual, they have agency to make decisions, they have a sense of self, they have a self-consciousness, so to speak, and they have the full gamut of emotions. Take me through a little bit of how the research paradigm really discovers that. How is that information gleaned from a population or a species of animals? Because you've done it. I'm just curious how that is really etched and done scientifically.
Yeah. Well, the first thing, because I'm what you call an ethologist, like Conrad Lorenz was a very famous ethologist.
Right.
He won the Nobel Prize with two other ethologists in 1973. That really angered the reductionist scientists like physiologists and biomedical researchers. It really did. So observation is, watching carefully is the root of it all. You just watch the animals. You don't mess around with them. You don't get them to do things that you want them to do. You then come up with what's called an ethogram, which is like a list of the different behaviors that they perform. Descriptive: walking slowly, chin rest, standing over another animal. And you then just, my work really involved just a lot of watching and observation and filming, and then playing back the films over and over and over again. And one of my specialties for years has been play behavior. So in the ethological tradition, there's a number of different areas people follow. One would be evolution. So the question there would be, why did play evolve? What's it good for? I mean, that's really what it boils down to for a lay audience. Why did it arise, and why was it retained in, say, in the repertoire of a species, focusing away from individuals? Adaptation: how does playing in different ways allow an individual to adapt to their social and or asocial environment? Causation, which means what causes the behavior. So it could be, say in the case of dogs, it could be another dog who you like and you want to, or you've already played with and they're your play friend, or a dog you want to meet and you play with them. So something external. But causation also refers to the neural causation, the neural basis and the hormonal basis of behavior. And the last is development. And that's where I focused, is how do individual differences arise in the life of each and every individual. And when I did 8.5 years of field work on wild coyotes in Wyoming. I also studied penguins in Antarctica. And people say, they all look alike. They all do the same thing. No. Even penguins are, when you really study them, they don't all look alike. But even when young coyotes emerged from the den in the wild at 21 days of age, there were bold animals, individuals, shy individuals, individuals who you hoped you never saw again. And I don't really mean that in a negative way. They were just so obnoxious at 21 days of age. So that's the basic paradigm.
I see. When we play, talking about play, you know, there's a social aspect to play because we're interacting socially, especially with teams and things of that nature.
Mhm.
But there's a competitive outcome, an end game to a certain degree. Do animals demonstrate that too? Is there any part of that, or is it just play without the competitive nature demonstrated by some of the kinds of sports and games that we play?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most social play among non-human animals is the result is it's non-competitive. You know, it's actually very rare. I mean, but it's an attention getter. So I
Right.
spend a lot of time at dog parks. So when I was in the field studying coyotes and I've looked at the wolves in Yellowstone, you know, it really catches your eye when two animals are playing and then it escalates into aggression. But it's actually rather rare that it escalates into serious aggression. But when it does, it has social consequences, especially for the animal who violates what I call the golden rule of play, and it's play fairly. Um, and that was one of the big things that I studied years ago. I mean, in all honesty, I had no idea where I was going with it. I mean, no one had ever had that idea. And here we are outside of Jackson, Wyoming, in the middle of nowhere, studying coyotes. But one big bumper sticker from that work is if you want to play and you want to be incorporated into a social group, you need to play fair. And when I published that work, it attracted the attention of a lot of elementary school teachers and counselors. So I did a kid's book called Animals at Play, Rules of the Game. And, you know, biologists were interested in it, but all of a sudden I'm getting asked to come to do school programs. And I also work with Jane Goodall's Roots and Shoots group, which deals with people of all ages and, you know, cultures. And the two merged beautifully because I could go talk to first grade students. The teachers would read them my book. And then I would play films of dogs playing at a local dog park. And you want to get kids into something, you talk about dogs playing or cats playing as well.
And so the cognitively, when you talk about cognitive ethology, they're many times, so they have a sense, truly a sense of the rules of the game. I mean, they actually cognitively, whatever is established in that play, and if there are certain rules to how that game is being played in a species, they will demonstrate a knowledge really of those rules, a sense of what the rules are for that game. Is that what you observed?
Yeah, the two actions they do, one is called self-handicapping. So that's why a dachshund can play with a Great Dane. I mean,
Nice.
it's sort of the way to look at it. It's also the reason that you can have a really high-ranking animal play with a low-ranking animal. They self-handicap. The bigger animal, the more dominant animal doesn't bite as hard, doesn't, you know, bump into another animal as hard as they can, you know, smash them across a dog park or something. And so, yeah. And then, you know, you also have them being very carefully asking to play, you know,
Interesting.
very, you know, most people who have dogs know about what's called the play bow, where they lean, you know, they crouch forward and they put their butts up in the air, they wag their tail. And that's typically used only in play. What we also discovered, and this was something that I never realized actually how important it was, that when play seems to escalate and may get out of hand, they'll do a play bow again to say, hey, I just want to really play with you. I'm not trying to fight or mate with you. So they use play signals, in this case, the play bow, as punctuation to say, yeah, I know I bit you too hard or I hit you too hard. You see this in kids all of the time where they'll vocalize. I mean, when I watch kids in, you know, elementary schools, they'll go, oh, I didn't mean to hit you that hard, or I didn't mean to chase you, but I still want to play. And that's the functional equivalent of the play bow.
Huh.
Yeah.
I'm here with Professor Marc Bekoff, and we're going to take just a few moments to hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association. You're listening to the Health Science Podcast Show. I want to remind you to visit the National Health Association website, where you'll find incredible resources to support your healthy lifestyle, including plant-exclusive eating, without added salt, oil, and sugar. Simply go to healthscience.org or nationalhealthassociation.org. Be sure to check out membership, which is only $35 per year for those living within the United States and $55 for those living outside the U.S. You'll be amazed at all the information and benefits you'll receive. As a member, you're kept up to date on the latest evidence-based tools for health promotion. You'll receive the incomparable quarterly magazine, Health Science, a beautiful 40-page advertising-free publication mailed to your home or offices, loaded with articles, recipes, inspirational stories, and interviews with world leaders in the fields of personal health, plant-based nutrition, water-only fasting, animal rights, and environmental support. And you'll receive details about life-changing events, such as the extraordinary annual conference of the National Health Association and diverse opportunities for plant-exclusive NHA cruises and travel vacations to exotic destinations around the globe. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and now back to the show. Welcome back to the Health Science Podcast. I'm here with Professor Marc Bekoff. Marc, if you really look at human behavior, we could make the case on some level that the highest ideals of human behavior or human mindset are things like compassion, empathy, love, things that take us out of the ego of our personal mindset into an agenda to something with concerns bigger than ourselves. Mm-hmm. And, when you look at animals, I always comes to mind, I was fascinated with bonobos very early on as non-human primates that have always been talked about as having some of the greatest empathy of all primates, including human primates. When we look at those ideals, aside from the non-human primates like bonobos and elephants, which we know really demonstrate those characteristics, do you see that ubiquitously across many species, those highest ideals that we associate primarily with being more sophisticated humans, like compassion and empathy and love, those kinds of qualities?
Yeah, you do. I mean, it's a great question because I'm really a carnivore expert. So I know coyotes and wolves and, wild mountain lions, cougars, and lions in Africa, cheetahs. Yeah, you do see that kind of care and compassion within these animals. They're not all just, I don't know, Arnold Schwarzenegger like meat eaters who kill everything. And, so you see them caring for individuals in need, helping them, feeding them, sometimes sharing food, grooming them. And there's a man named Rick McIntyre who's published 4 really great books about the wolves of Yellowstone. That's really the big project in America. And he's seen very high-ranking male wolves care for and go hang out with very subordinate youngsters. So yeah, and when you think about it, you live in a social group. It's like a small group of humans where you've got a lot of social dynamics going on. And once again, after 5,000, if you will, total group hours of watching wild coyotes, we were still learning something after 8.5 years. I mean, the curve asymptotes, it's vertical when you start a study. But yeah, you do. And there's great stories of a dog walking across an icy lake to guide another dog across the water who was afraid to step on the ice. So yeah.
Where I want to go next is I want to plunge a little deeper into something because it plays into the whole idea of veganism and the choices we make that are respectful of animals and the environment in which we live. And that is the whole issue of thingness and personhood with animals, because I love that Psychology Today piece you did that talked about animals are not things, and used the model of Happy the elephant that was kind of incarcerated in the Bronx Zoo. I'm from the Bronx. You're from Brooklyn. I lived literally 2 minutes walking distance from the Bronx Zoo. So I
Okay.
spent a lot of my early childhood in the Bronx Zoo. But I love the interview in through that with Sam Machado, who did that graphic novel
Yep.
on Happy the elephant.
Yep.
And this idea that, we see animals as things, objects for our food, our entertainment, and not as the personhood or the individuals that they are. And we talk about that having a kind of a long cultural tradition in the Western world, going back to early Greeks and even before, that laid the groundwork for what then becomes a mindset that feeds, industries of violence and devastation in our food supply. And so
Yep.
let's talk about how, because, most people, when they have their house pets, they feel all of those things. They feel their individuality, they feel all of that. So where does that disconnect come with that cultural tradition on really challenging this thingness, this personhood of these animals?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I've written about it and I've talked to people about it. Yeah, there's a special relationship we have with dogs, and I study dogs, and I always think of how dogs could serve as what I call a gateway species, and help to bridge the empathy gap to other animals, including who we eat. I always say who we eat, not what we eat, because we're eating sentient beings. And I think what you're talking about is happening more and more now. The law, it's all grounded in law, where animals are property, things, objects, unfeeling objects. And so the personhood work that's being done by Steve Wise and a number of other attorneys, it's tired. I mean, I don't see how they keep doing it. And I don't mean that in a negative way. They present all the evidence of how smart and how emotional Happy the elephant is, or a chimpanzee. And then a judge will say, well, but the law says they're property.
Right.
So,
well, these guys are these attorneys are working tirelessly to kind of, express the habeas corpus rights of these animals, meaning challenging the constitutional rights to be unlawfully incarcerated and confined. Are they making headway in the courts with that? Do you see that happening?
I think they are. Yeah, I do think they are. It's getting a lot more attention. I mean, we're still waiting for the huge breakthrough case, but I really do. And I'm hoping that what comes out of this, when non-humans are seen as legal persons or legal subjects, that it'll really spill down, into how they're treated and how they're not allowed to be, incarcerated. That's what a zoo is. That's where they are.
Absolutely.
They're in a cage, and people don't like it. And I've taught in the Boulder County Jail for almost 20 years as part of James Roots and Shoots group organization, courses in animal behavior and conservation, and having spent a lot of time with human beings who are incarcerated. These animals in zoos are incarcerated too.
Right. Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about that is that mentality of confinement and incarceration is, of course, the foundation of all animal agriculture. So that mentality feeds industries of violence, destruction, and death that we see, or many people just globally take for granted, which, of course, we in organizations like this and people adopting vegan lifestyles have been battling, so that we could create more animal protection and more environmental protection. So what was the outcome with Happy the elephant from the Bronx Zoo? Was there any positive outcome, or did it just kind of fall by the wayside?
I haven't kept up with it totally, but I think it's still, if you will, a work in progress.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't know, but I think it's still a work in progress. And the one thing about it is it's attracted a lot of popular attention. When you talk to lay people about this, or my friends who aren't scientists, and I talk to them about this, they go, you academics just beat the heck out of everything.
Right. Right.
Of course, Happy's a sentient being. the one word that they kind of hesitate at is called, it's personhood.
Right.
You know, I mean, so is happy a person? Well, I mean, yeah, she could be in terms of the criteria that you would apply to personhood. My mom went through a serious physical and it decline, had severe dementia. She was still a person,
Right.
and stuff like that. But you know, I really like, you said something that made me think about it. Maybe if there was like another word, or just referring to them as subjects of a life, not an object. But I
Well,
do
even individuals, you know, that are they should have the dignity of all individuals. Why not? I mean, there's no reason not to, because of the fact that they have this full gamut of emotions and agency and all the things that you've talked and spoken about and taught for decades. So yeah, you know, it's interesting because I want to segue from that into part of that article that you wrote, because it was very intriguing to me, and I think it touches on how people respond to that thingness and the way the cultural perspectives reinforce that. Were you, in the article you wrote about your early performance, because you were competitive in skiing and biking and tennis, and then of course you are still a biker and still are very active, and that's all beautiful. But it's very intriguing because you made the point in that article that as of the 1980s, you knew that there was no necessity to eat meat. And yet you went from that period of time, because from there till about 2005 before you committed to being completely vegan. So if you look at those 20 years, even you, with the incredible knowledge that you have of the individuality and the right of these animals to survive and to be who they are, because you associated your athletic performance with the intake of these kinds of proteins, it actually, in a way, kept you for 20 years not making that commitment. And I think that that's a really telling point of how the culture is phrased around those demands. And I'm assuming now that you're probably happy with movies like Game Changers and all these movements of these high quality and high performing athletes who have realized that going plant exclusive allows them to perform and recover better than they ever have. But it's intriguing, even with all of your information, that took that 20-year period to really make that full commitment.
Yeah, I mean, Luis Cejoyos, who actually produced it, lived in Boulder. Game Changers. What wasn't clear there, and I'm not making, you know, any excuses for my behavior. So I really went.
Yeah, I'm not pointing fingers at you either. I want you to understand that. I'm just really, it's amazing to me how, you know, we have those cultural preconceived notions of what we need to eat to be able to live and perform in certain ways, because we've been giving that from the moment we were born. It's been inundated into the, you know, the early models in the early school cafeterias with the basic 4 food groups, and 2 of those are meat and dairy. You know, it's like, you know, so that goes back to early conditioning, and it's hard to sometimes go through that discipline of unlearning, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, what I started doing, and it was late 80s, I stopped eating meat totally.
Right.
My only violations, if you will, of veganism for about 10 years, 12 years maybe, were maybe an egg a week or a piece of cheese. I mean, and then it was a young girl at a talk. I mean, maybe a young teenage girl said, somebody said, "Are you vegan?" And I said, "No, but I actually did the calculations at about 99.5% of my diet was vegan." Right. And really, she said to me, "Frank, so why do you have that piece of cheese every other week?" So I stopped.
It's a great question, because we have this issue that even that 0.5%, we're going to kind of hold on to that, because somewhere in the back of our minds, that echo of, you know, you need these kinds of proteins to be able to do what you need to do in the world. And it's kind of intriguing. And I'm glad that, you know, there's been the escalation of, you know, non-animal based substitutes for many of those foods. They're not ideal in health, but they do help people in the transition to a different mindset, which is important, I think.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I kept doing it for one reason only. It wasn't performance. It was, I really liked good high-end cheeses.
Cheese was one of the hardest things for me in my own transition, because it even has its own little opiate addictive quality. You've got casomorphines that are very opiate-like. So when you withdraw from cheese, there's a little bit of an opiate withdrawal that happens. So,
Oh,
and it's kind of intriguing to see that and to feel that.
I did not know that. And then when I went totally vegan, people, because I was still competing pretty high level in my age group, people said, "Oh, you're done." No, not even close. And I love it that because I live in Boulder, and Boulder's not as high end as a lot of people think it is. And but my doc is vegan. She's a 60-year-old world level ultra marathoner, and so I love the fact, because I've had friends go in to see their physicians, and their physicians will say, I see you're still a high-end runner or a hiker or a trail runner or a cyclist. If you ate meat, you'd do better. and
I know, that's so funny.
It's so ridiculous because these people are really high-end athletes in their 60s and 70s. And no, it's not a matter whether they would do better or not. They're also leaving the ethical question aside, of course, and the junk, if you will, that's in meat. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. And well, I'm speaking here with Dr. Marc Bekoff. And Marc, where can people find you? What's a good place to kind of zero in on you, a URL, a location online where they can learn more about everything that you've done and what you're doing?
Yep. My website is just marcbekoff.com. And I write regularly for Psychology Today. So if they did a search, Marc Bekoff Psychology Today, they'd come up with a lot of stuff.
And I want to emphasize that those articles are fantastic. I went through about 2 or 3 of them, and they were amazing. And it's just very thought provoking. And I think it's time that people have that kind of provocation of thought, especially at a time now where we know these choices have ramifications far beyond our own personal health into the protection of all the creatures around us and the planet itself. So talk to me a little bit. I was very intrigued, and I loved the artwork and so on of your Boulder Art Behind Bars program. Talk about that and the impact on incarcerated primates.
I think you and I, maybe Jane Goodall too, would be the only people who would refer to them that way. Yeah, I mean, I started the course, and it was interesting because it went back to my research on play. And I was talking to Jane. We were traveling somewhere, and her Roots and Shoots groups have gone from working with youngsters into refugee camps, assisted living all over the world, 100 and something countries. And I said, I think maybe I'll start looking into whether I can teach one at the Boulder County Jail. And people would say, well, it's just a country club. No. I always invite them to spend a night in the Boulder. And I don't mean that as a negative thing, but no, jails are not country clubs. No. And so I approached the people there who were running the transitions program, it's called. And when I went in and said, I'd like to teach a course on animal behavior, they laughed, not in a derogatory way. And I said, yeah, you know what I'd like to do is I've done a lot of work on play behavior and fairness and how play can generate compassion and camaraderie. They loved it. So I started doing it. I think my class became one of the most popular classes, in the jail. And then a lot of these guys I was teaching men are wonderful writers. One wrote a book while he was there, and artists. So they would draw, pictures of animals. You've seen some, and they could.
Yeah, some of those ones online were pretty amazing. I thought the artwork was fantastic, and I think the inspirational messages, these 2-word phrases and so on, connected to that, are they're incredible. And I think that they provide a big service for people, looking and wanting to get little sound bites of the importance of this. And it's such a great program that you've created there.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that, because I see some of the guys who've gotten out around town. One of them basically is homeless, and he still draws. And I see him, not every day, but I see him a lot on one of the bike paths where he lives in a tent in a tunnel. But I run into these guys, and they really, it really touches my heart, because they say how doing the artwork and learning about the nice side of animal behavior, like you read the headline in a paper when there's a war or some violence, and they say they acted like animals. No. animals do fight, but don't use that. They're acting like animals. And some of these guys have gone on to get master's degrees. They've gone back to school. Some of the art won awards. I'm still carrying a certificate for the last 15 years for a guy who did a beautiful drawing of a chimpanzee, and he's out. I mean, what I mean is he didn't come back, but
Right.
I submitted his drawing to an art contest, and he won an art festival.
I was going to ask you about that, because many times when people go to prison, it's a college for crime, as you well know. So recidivism, getting back in, is really big time.
Yep.
With programs like this, has anyone done any evaluation to look at recidivism rates of the people that you've actually exposed to your information and courses?
It's much less. Yeah,
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that's the way it's got to go. I mean, talking about rehabilitation, compassion, empathy, and sharing these models of different ways of looking at the world, as you made the point, nonviolence. It's intriguing to me, Marc, too, because when we look at what we're calling a global perspective of thingness and lack of personhood for these animals, it's intriguing that that seems to be a little bit more of a Western way of looking at the world. A lot of Eastern concepts, you can go back centuries and you've got models for ahimsa with Jains and with Buddhists and with Hindus, where that idea of the autonomy and the right to life and do no harm was such a major part of those cultures. So it's intriguing that while we focus on the shortcomings of the way things have transpired and evolved to some degree in our side of the world, there are populations of humans. So it kind of is part of the DNA of humans to be able to accommodate that way of looking at the world. And I think that's where the power of this kind of plant way of living, when you get past just the physical health outcome and you realize what it's really talking about fundamentally, is a very profound way to shift mindset and and really alter the neurological tapestry of how we interpret information and provide, become real caretakers, caregivers for the less fortunate species and people around us.
Yeah, I mean, some of the guys in my class went vegetarian. Some came in vegetarian and went vegan. And you know what? I thought, oh my goodness, it's going to really, people are going to make fun of them and all that. They never did. I mean, they really never did. Somebody might say, oh yeah, Frank's now vegetarian because of you. Ha ha ha. It wasn't said as a derisive comment.
Right.
And things like that, and the other thing really was, they learned that, for example, among wolves, they fight and they have dominance relationships, but they also do a lot of cooperative behavior. Where we started, you asked me questions about empathy, compassion, and they do, like bonobos are, a pretty classic case of that.
Right.
And so they really learned that I told them they could not use the phrase someone acted like an animal when there was a fight or something.
Right.
And stuff. So, I had no idea how that was going to work out, but it worked out great. And I've had a lot of emails from people. There's a woman in Michigan who actually has the inmates in her class read my book, The Emotional Lives of Animals.
Right.
So, you never, as far as I'm concerned, you just put it out there. I would openly talk about being vegan and nobody laughed at me.
Right.
And things like that. People said, oh, they'll think you're some kind of softy. No, they didn't. It was just, I think
when you put it out into the universe the way you're talking, I really believe there's a genetic machinery, a DNA that really embraces these higher ideals that stem from this way of thinking and living. There's a part of us that gravitates to that. And I think when you tap into that, even the most hardened person can you see some of the biggest guys that look like rough and tumble with the smallest little dogs, and they're like petting them. And you see this kind of love relationship that happens that is so part of I liked what you called the biophilic DNA, which was interesting. And in one of your phrases, I like that phrase a lot.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to say too, Frank, is that there's a whole move in comparative psychology and in ethology. and it refers to the survival of the friendliest, survival of the nicest. And these are by high-end award-winning scientists.
Right.
So,
I've read some of that. Yes.
they're not saying that, they're not saying non-humans don't fight. They do fight, but it's really coming out now that cooperation and, if you will, being nice is also the cornerstone for the building of social groups.
Right.
You can't have 6 alpha wolves living together. They're just going to beat the hell out of one another, and they won't have a group. So I love this conversation with you, and I too think a lot of it comes down back to meal plans. I just do, I mean.
Now,
Yeah.
I know you're very, you're very active in your life physically. I know exercise is a big piece. What, in terms of your professional work, are you just looking to do more of the same, or you have any big projects or other things on the horizon for you? What's coming up?
Well, a second edition of my book, The Emotional Lives of Animals, will be out in March. And I thought, oh yeah, I can revise it. It'll be easy. And there were a lot of days, because I get up around 4 in the morning. I'm really a morning person.
Right.
I'd be sitting at my computer going, did you really do this voluntarily? did you really do that? So that's big. And I'm working in the field of compassionate conservation. And when you use the phrase "do no harm," that's one of the cornerstones of compassionate conservation. The two major tenets are, first, do no harm, and the life of every individual matters. Sentient or not. I mean,
Right.
We're going to probably find out over the years that sentience, I call it the community of sentience, if you will, the biodiversity of sentience. In some countries, you can't eat lobsters, cephalopods, for example. So I'm really active in compassionate conservation because at heart, I'm really a field biologist. And
Well, tell me what that looks like practically when you say compassionate conservation. Is that outreach into communities? Is that how does that manifest in any practical way? Can you talk about that briefly?
Yeah, it's a great question. Another basic tenet is that all stakeholders matter. So we're working for the non-humans and the humans. We're accepting the fact that, in some African communities, elephants are a disaster. They take away the livelihood of people. In some, and I've been to East Africa, lions kill, a person might have 1 cow and 1 goat. A lion kills a goat, they've lost half their inventory, half what they have. So yes, it takes into account all stakeholders, and it asks people to just think of non-lethal alternatives. That killing members of one species to save members of another species seems ludicrous, and things like that. And one classic example was this young Maasai boy who just did not want to kill the lions who were killing all the animals of the local Maasai population. He hung up Christmas lights. And it stopped a lot of the killing. Another would be, and some people don't like it, but if I were going to get shot, I'd rather get shot with a paintball gun than with an Uzi.
Right.
Is using paintball guns because it hurts. It's aversive and it drives them out. But the other really is getting the thought about non-lethal alternatives on the table, and they're working. In one big project in India was where there were problems with tigers. They stopped talking about problem animals. They talked about problem locations. Mm-hmm. Because you start talking about problem animals, people get scared and they'll go shoot them. So they kept saying there's a problem location, there are tigers there, so avoid them.
Right.
So it's working, and it's all for biodiversity. And to me, frankly, and I'm not alone, but I'm not saying everyone feels this way, is that it's really hard for me sometimes to understand. And maybe understand some of my past, like we were talking, that right now we know so much about how we can help other animals. I don't understand how people can go out and spend their days saving animals and then sitting down and eating a steak. And
it's incongruent. There's no question.
So there's a move now where plant-based diets at some meetings they're the default, and you have to ask for meat. And I don't say that in a pejorative way, because I went to some conservation meetings where they had vegan, plant-based and meat. And if you got in line too late, all the plant-based food was gone, and it was being eaten by people who were carnivores. So at this meeting, they went out and bought more veggie food, and it became a joke. But I think it was really a good move where you let the vegan vegetarian people eat the vegan vegetarian food first, because I got at the end of the line the first night, there was no vegetarian or vegan food. So I love that. So I like that, if you will, the default that they serve vegetarian, vegan food, and if you want meat, you can get it, but it's not there. And it's surprising, maybe not so surprising to you and me, how few people ask for the meat. They just eat what's presented to them.
Well, there are populations and countries now where there's just an explosion of veganism. And I spend a lot of time, even like in the UK, which I think people historically think of as a meat and potato culture. It has one of the biggest expansive vegan approaches to food availability and food prep. And so I'm loving to see that, because we know that many of these major problems we're dealing with, climate change and biodiversity loss and so on, is, of course, the dependence on animal and dairy food production. And so we need to see that change. And I'm like you. I know that you're an optimist. I am optimistic about it. I spend a lot of time in my own life trying to work consciously sharing that information, but that's the direction we have to go. Marc, as we wind down, is there any final words you'd like to share with the audience out here?
Since we're talking about health, we're talking about dogs and we're talking about meal plans. I encourage anybody who has a companion dog, or cat or other animal. I wrote this book to get people to become fluent in dog, because the more you understand about the animals, the better the relationship you will have with them. And I always talk about the way I went vegetarian was overnight. I call it cold tofu. Right. I mean, I was traveling, I don't know, 100,000. I was flying 100,000 miles a year or more for years. And people would say, well, you really can't be vegan. And I'm going, pasta, salad, potatoes.
Of course.
And I wasn't trying to be a blank about it. It's like, well, of course you can. I love pasta. I love olive oil. I love bread and stuff. So one of the things I've been talking a lot with my friends and some of the cyclists I ride with, many of whom have gone vegetarian and vegan, by the way, is it's not that hard. You may have to do a little more planning at the beginning, but, I also like potato chips and French fries. And so I can get my calories in for the hundreds of miles I ride a week. So that's one main message. It's not that difficult to change your meal plan, right? And also watch animals and appreciate them for who they are, not what they are. And that gets back to your personhood thing.
Yes. Well, I want to really thank my very special guest, Dr. Marc Bekoff, today for sharing his heart, his inspiration, his information. It was a fascinating talk. I loved it. And I urge the people out there to follow Marc, go online. His URL is in the show notes, and you'll see that there, and see the material he's written, the platforms he's been showing on, the shows that he's involved in, and the work that he's doing. It's transformative and so important. And I really want to thank all of you out there for joining us today. Without you, we couldn't do what we do. And I want to thank you for being part of this very active and healthy community. And on behalf of the National Health Association, I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Health Science Podcast. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Marc. Really, thank you.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.